So let's talk plus ones, guys. What I mean by that is any type of card that allows you to get rid of an opponent's card, basically trading it for something else. Plus one in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is when you summon something, and not only does it essentially get rid of one card, like it traded itself for something, it also gets rid of another thing. Like, let's say you summon Newdoria, for example, right? This thing, if it's destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, targets a monster in the field and destroys it. Let's say this ran over something. Let's say you could get over a monster with 1200 attack. Alright, it basically just traded itself for that card. Meaning that if this ends up going to the graveyard, it did its job, it got rid of something. But here's the kicker, right? If it's destroyed by battle, it targets a monster in the field and destroys it. So let's say you killed something by battle with this, and then your opponent runs this over with another monster, and you use this effect to destroy an opponent's card. You essentially plus one. Your card ended up equaling 2 of your opponent's cards. Like, think of this game, and I know a lot of people probably won't like this idea, but think of this game as a math game, right? Your opponent starts with 4 cards, you start with 5 if you're going second. You're already up on them 1 card. The upside to their side is that they got to set up first. So you're basically playing the game of keep up while they are slowly whittling away your options. That's why first is still better than second, even though card economy says second would be better, especially now. But the reason a lot of people now are going second is because they are playing Inner Conflict, and that card lets you take an opponent's card once per duel and do whatever you want with it. You could essentially do nothing with it, but it does net them 1 less card on their field that turn. So if you do give it back to them, they get their advantage back in their 1 card, but if you get rid of it by tributing it or doing something else with it, whereas they don't get it back, you've basically gone up on them 2 cards, 1 in the skill taking their card and 1 in the draw for your turn, without doing much of anything. In addition to that, cards like Breaker the Magical Warrior end up being super relevant right now because when you summon this, you can pop a spell or trap on the field. If you pop a spell or trap on your opponent's field, it's already traded itself essentially, meaning Breaker doesn't have to do anything for the rest of the game. It got rid of a card. It counted as it traded itself for something else. But then if you have Breaker run over something else, like a monster, let's say, you've essentially plus 1. And the Monarch decks that play in this game right now are a lot of little plus 1s. Like something like Grandmarg, which is similar to Breaker, you'll tribute summon it, you'll target a set card and destroy it, and then if Grandmarg runs over something, you've plus 1. Or, let's say you target a set card, destroy it, and then you swing and they Book of Moon, you still plus 1 because you destroy the set card and their Book of Moon on their field has been used on your Grandmarg, essentially rendering it useless to destroy something on your field by battle. You've just 2 for 1 to your opponent. Now, Grandmarg's a little bit of an odd example because you do have to tribute summon a monster on your field to do so. So let's say the monster that you had on your field hadn't done anything yet, hadn't traded itself, so to speak. Then to tribute it for Grandmarg, you've essentially negged yourself 1 or minus 1. If you then target a set card on the field and destroy it, you've broke even. And then if Grandmarg destroys something on the field, you technically would plus 1. It's a slippery slope of a debate as to finiting exactly how every single card either breaks even, minus 1s or plus 1s or whatever. But it's the reason that Grandmarg is seeing more play than Jinzo right now. Now, Jinzo in the format means that a lot of people haven't played as many traps, and that's relevant, that's prominent. It's kind of like the old school logic of why Heavy Storm shouldn't be banned, although now Harpy's Feather Duster exists. So I guess you can use that logic in today's game, which is the fear of it exists, therefore no one will set 5 cards blindly, right? Like before Harpies came back, and this was the argument when Heavy Storm was banned, or when it came back, was the fear of the card in the format exists, then people are going to be more prevalent to play around it. Let's say you open 5 back row, but you know Heavy Storm is in the game, or Harpy's Feather Duster is in the game, and let's say your 5 back row, any of your 5 cards don't stop Harpy's Feather Duster / Heavy Storm, you're not going to probably set all 5, because you don't want your opponent to top deck that card and wipe you out. At that point, they essentially plus 4 on you. Heavy Storm trades itself for 1 of the cards of your 5 back row, and the other 4 were destroyed in the process. It's really disgusting like that. Jinzo does the same thing in this format, in the Speed Duel format, where because it exists, a lot of people will play less trap cards because they know if everyone's playing Jinzo, whether it be in the main or their side decks, your trap cards aren't always going to be live. So a lot of people have shifted to more quick play spells such as Book of Moon, Offerings of the Doom that was played anyways, but you'll see this more, and cards like Shrink actually see play now, more so than a lot of trap cards. But Jinzo has one big drawback, and that is that it doesn't actually net you anything. It doesn't gain you advantage in terms of card economy. Sure, you can stun cards, but there's a difference between stunning them and getting rid of them. If you stun something like Zoma the Spirit, for example, Zoma then goes back into the trap zone. It's negated for the entirety of it being on the field, even if Jinzo leaves the field. So in that sense, Jinzo ended up trading itself for a Zoma at the bare minimum. But if it's not a continuous card, if something like Widespread Ruin, Lost Wind, Draining Shield to a lesser extent is face down, this doesn't stop those cards from being used later in the duel. It just stops them while it's on the field. Now, sometimes that's all that matters, but like I said, people understand that this exists. They're not playing cards like this as much, at least not in the main deck. You're seeing more things like Book of Moon, Offerings of the Doomed, etc. So Jinzo almost does nothing in that sense. It's almost just a vanilla when it comes out. Now, there are a lot of decks recently that have seen this, and to a lesser extent, a few other traps in the main deck, but most of the time it's in people's side decks right now because they know this exists in the game. So the problem with playing Jinzo at multiples in any deck right now is that it doesn't do a whole lot. Let's say Jinzo wasn't played in the meta, it'd be a whole different story. Meaning it would be something your opponent wouldn't expect, but the problem is a lot of people will then see it in the main deck, copy it, and then the format becomes Jinzo's in the main deck again, and then the cycle just repeats itself. So Jinzo's always had this up and down depending on the format. Spell Canceller to a much lesser extent, but Spell Canceller's 1800 attack, a lot of level 4 monsters can kill this, so it doesn't see nearly as much play. So in pops Grandmark the Rock Monarch. Now this is by far probably the worst Monarch, but it's the only Monarch we have in Speed Duels, and even when this came to Speed Duels, I originally was like, oh well, no one will play that, it's too situational. But it's really not right now. It gets rid of a card. It trades itself immediately upon hitting the board. Similar to Dark Red Enchanter to a lesser extent, but still hits a card in the hand most likely if it hits the board, and if it hits the board and your opponent doesn't want their hand hit, they'll most likely Book of Moon it or do something to it to get rid of it off the field, and it still traded itself for a card. So these cards are actually seeing more play right now because they actually get rid of something immediately, or at the very least force the opponent to still use a card on them to get rid of them off the board. The difference is Grandmark on the Tribute Summons effect activates 100%. This is an ignition effect. It's a once per turn. You can remove 2 spell counters, so it's kind of like Breaker in the sense of it summons, it gets a counter, but they can get rid of it or book it or whatever before you use its effect. Whereas Grandmark's effect is resolving as soon as its tribute summoned successfully. The argument with that is that Blowback Dragon will see some play here and there because, again, it can get rid of a card. And it's like, if you're going to play Jinzo that doesn't get rid of anything versus a card that can get rid of something, some people are taking that risk. Now, I personally look at Blowback as too much of a risk. If I'm going to risk an effect that might not happen for 100 points more in Jinzo and a much, much better effect for the people that do have the trap still in their main decks, I'm taking Jinzo like 100%. They're both dark, so they're both allure targets. They're both machines if we're playing some type of machine deck. I'm definitely playing Jinzo over Blowback, but I do understand the argument as to why Blowback sees play. But if you don't want to play a normal monster, essentially, if your opponent isn't playing traps, that's 2400, to deal with the potential threat of the mirror match, in steps Kaiser Glider, which is seeing more play, especially in side decks lately, which is one tribute 2400 that does not die by battle with monsters with the same attack. You'd think that by itself would be enough, but oh no, 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 no. This card also has an effect where if it's destroyed and sent to the grave, destroyed doesn't even have to be by battle, could be by a card effect. You target one monster on the field and return that target to the hand. Now, does that net you card economy? It depends. If you target an extra deck monster, which you most likely will not be doing in Speed Duels, it goes back to the extra deck, so yes, it nets you card economy. It nets you card advantage. But if you bounce anything else to your opponent's hand, you're not changing the amount of cards your opponent has versus how much you have, so you're not +1ing essentially. But depending on board presence, it could swing a game in your favor. So Kaiser Glider is a very specific card for something like that. What I also like about Kaiser is he's 22 defense, so Book of Moon, unless they have a 2400 monster, doesn't do a whole lot to this in the sense of, like, if you flip Jinzo face down, he's 15 defense, most things can run over that. If you flip Grandmark face down, he's 1000 defense, almost everything can get over that. Dark Red Enchanter is a similar concept here where it has 2200 defense, but Kaiser Glider, in my opinion, is just a little bit better, depending on the matchup, of course, and that defense is real strong, so, you know, you gotta take what you can get with it. Another example of returning is Bizar Shock, which has seen play as well, where it's a 1 tribute monster with garbage stats that says if it's summoned it returns all set cards on the field to the hand. That's great and all, but you need to capitalize on that return that turn. Otherwise, this effect does a whole lot of nothing. And the only time I can see this card being really relevant is if you've already established the board, you then summon this by, I don't know, let's say interconflicting your opponent's monster, you return all their back row to their hand, and then you try to swing face. But it's still very situational, but it does have the upside of being dark for something like Allure, so there is that. But back on the +1 argument. Let's talk about Guilford the Lightning and Moisture Creature, 2 cards that see almost 0 play. I don't think I've actually seen either one of these see play competitively in a very long time. They both say if you could tribute summon them by tributing 3 monsters, but you don't set them. And if it's summoned this way, it does X. This one destroys all monsters your opponent controls. Moisture Creature destroys all spell traps your opponent controls. That's great and all, but especially in 3-zone Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can't really get a whole lot out of these. You're sacrificing 3 monsters for this. So the bare minimum, you're sacrificing 3 cards to destroy a max of 3 monsters your opponent controls. You've still -1. You see what I'm saying? But let's talk something like Kaiku. This card says if it inflicts battle damage, you can target up to 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard and banish those targets. Actually, in the graveyards. It doesn't even have to be the opponent's grave. If you're looking at this now as inflicting damage, let's say it kills a monster and inflicts damage in the process. Let's say it kills a breaker at 1600, so you're doing 200 points of damage, so you're getting this effect. Kaiku traded itself for the breaker, because if Kaiku does nothing else and gets destroyed in the field, you at least 1 for 1 off of that. But then it banishes 2 monsters, let's say, from your opponent's graveyard. Technically, this is not a +2, because graveyard doesn't count card economy, unless the deck specifically calls for graveyard effects such as XYZ. Now, XYZ is a bit finicky because Union Scramble can add a card back that was banished, but if they want to use their skill, they have to banish from field and or graveyard, and if you banish them with Kaiku, you technically plus, but you're not plussing in card economy, so that's the difference there. You have to look at it as card economy, as to whether or not your card is plussing you or not. And like I said, DD Crow, perfect other example of this. You discard it to banish a card from the opponent's graveyard. Technically you're minusing 1, but if that -1 nets you, but if your opponent's deck plays off whatever the card is in the graveyard that Crow is banishing, then maybe you're not minusing 1. Card economy you are, but card advantage, maybe not so much. Let's talk another example, Stratos. A lot of people call it the Stratos effect. Senju and Sonic Bird are technically Stratoses for specific things. This has a ritual spell, this adds a ritual monster. They've essentially replaced themselves. From your deck to your hand, they've added another card. So they replace themselves in your deck. Card advantage wise, that's pretty cool, but card economy, it's tricky. Because if you're counting hand and field like card economy tends to do, now you're 1 up on your opponent because you have another card in your hand. But it becomes a tough argument if that card isn't netting you anything immediately. So obviously if you're playing the long game, and you probably are if you're playing either one of these cards, you're playing Relinquished, so you're adding either the spell or the ritual monster from your deck to your hand. If you then capitalize on summoning those cards that turn, while summoning Relinquish requires you to -1 and or 2 because you're trading Black Illusion Ritual and whatever you're tributing for Relinquished, taking an opponent's monster then changes the numbers a bit. So let's say you tribute a monster from your field and hand, or hand from Black Illusion Ritual to summon Relinquished, you -2 to summon Relinquished. But let's say you banish Sphere Karibo for Black Illusion Ritual to summon Relinquished. At that point, you've only -1 by getting rid of Black Illusion Ritual to summon Relinquished. It took 2 cards to summon Relinquished. But if then Relinquished absorbs an opponent's monster, you broke even. If then Relinquished does anything else to get rid of an opponent's other card, like they Book of Moon it, or if they use Offerings of Doom or anything to try to get rid of it, you've +1. It's the reason I play the deck a lot, because the deck doesn't care about what else is relevant in the format, as of right now anyway. All it cares about is, does my opponent summon a monster that I can take with a decently high attack points? If the answer is yes, Relinquished, in my opinion, is always going to be good. If the answer is no, not so much, because then you have to rely on other cards in your deck forking over relevant offense. But right now, Monarch-type decks are big in the format, and they all have beefy stats, so Relinquished kind of powers on them. That's pretty good. Double Cyclone's a perfect card I can bring up here for an advantage type card. Does it net you advantage? Technically, no, it's a -1 because Double Cyclone plus a spell trap you control is destroying a spell trap your opponent controls. The only time you can make this a little bit more relevant is if you're destroying something, let's say, on Relinquished, to then use Relinquish's effect to then absorb an opponent's monster. Then I guess you broke even, but ever since the release of Cosmic Cyclone, Night Beam, and other better spell and trap destruction cards, Double Cyclone's kind of taken a backseat. However, in my opinion, it still thrives the most in either a deck based around Relinquish or in something that can utilize its destruction, such as Wild Tornado, where if this is set and let's say you Double Cyclone this and opponent's face down, Wild Tornado's effect then says if this set card is destroyed, you target a face-up card in the field to destroy it. But that's a situation where you have to open both of them and it's really situational already, so usually we don't deal with that. The reason I think Night Beam is so good right now is because it either breaks even or +1s. And what I mean by that is, how does this card +1? You target a set spell or trap card your opponent controls and destroy that target. Your opponent cannot activate the targeted card in response to this card's activation. That is true, but let's say they have two cards face down. Let's say they have Zoma the Spirit and Lost Wind and you have a Relinquish, right? Or any special summoned monster on your field. Let's say you target the Lost Wind with the Night Beam, okay? They can't chain this directly to it, but they can chain something else and then chain the card. They just can't chain it in direct response to Night Beam. So let's say Night Beam targets this, they chain their Zoma, then they use their Lost Wind on their Relinquished. Alright, successfully they've done what they wanted to do. However, your Night Beam just traded itself for 2 cards, so you +1'd. The Noblemans are a little bit more finicky once again, because the advantage they create involves the player's deck. Noblemen of Crossout will target a face-down monster on the field, destroy it, banish it, and if it's a flip monster, each player reveals their main deck and banishes all cards with that name. Extermination is similar, but it deals with spell and traps. Card Economy only counts things on the field and hand, whereas Card Advantage, a little bit different. These hitting out of the deck doesn't affect the field, but it can change the course of the game depending on the thing that it banishes. Free Preparation of Rites is a solid example of a +1. It adds both a ritual spell and a ritual monster to your hand. That's just trading 1 card for 2. Guys, it's a tough conversation to explain, especially on the terms of how deep you go into the conversation to see how many cards you're plussing and minusing. But at the end of the day, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always played like this, and if you think about it going into your next game, sometimes you end up finding ways to better your deck by looking at the ways you can plus or minus. So guys, let me know what you think about pluses and minuses in the comments down below. This is not the interesting video I was talking about, that is still to come in the future. But I definitely would like to do stuff like this more often, where we discuss pros and cons of certain things and just discussions in general. Like, it's nice change from watching Duel videos all the time. So leave your comments down below as to what you thought about this. Let me know if you want me to do more of these in the future. Comment, like, and subscribe as always. Click that notification bell to get all of our latest updates, and I'll see you guys in the next Yu-Gi-Oh! Video.